Hi, in this video, which is going to be a short one, we are going to hit on some of the most important topics concerning the autonomic nervous system. Much of this is actually reiterated from some of the previous information that we looked at with the nervous system, but I think it's worthwhile to maybe go over some of this. So the autonomic nervous system is really, autonomic means self-governing, meaning we don't have to think about some of the parameters our body is keeping us in, the homeostasis. So, oxygen levels, pH, blood glucose levels, blood calcium levels. We don't how dilated our blood vessels are or how constricted at any given moment to maintain blood pressure. We don't have to think about that. It is our autonomic nervous system that is controlling that. So we want to look at some, in this little talk, short talk, we want to look at some of the ways that this is actually carrying out all of these functions. So it really is regulating everything from heart rate, blood pressure, body temperature, all of those, oxygen, calcium, blood glucose, all of those things. So we understand the term homeostasis means that we're never in a state of just stagnant, not changing. It's always changing. Things are always getting a little high, then they're being brought back down low, and once they're too low, they're being brought back up. So we know about negative feedback and homeostasis. So what we also know is that if a species or an animal doesn't have an autonomic nervous system to actually control that, they could not survive without being kept warm and actually stress-free. So when we think, we'll go ahead and jump into some of this. We know that this is a motor nervous system that is controlling the glands and what the glands are secreting. It's even playing a role in the cardiac, your heart rate, that cardiac muscle and how often it beats, and smooth muscle, whether the smooth muscle is going to be relaxed and dilated or whether it's going to be constricted. So the primary organs that we think about, the viscera, which are organs of the thorax and the abdominal cavities, they're the primary organs that are going to be innervated by the autonomic nervous system. But there's also some more superficial structures as well, like the cutaneous blood vessels and sweat glands, and even those piloerector glands that we saw that are attached to hair follicles. So these are some of the primary organs. When we think about this and how this functions, it's under involuntary control. It's not like something that we can actually voluntarily, ask our blood vessels to constrict. We can't do that. So it's being monitored by this very select part of the nervous system. And an example of this homeostatic negative feedback, what is actually referring to, like when blood pressure is really high, is detected to be high. The blood pressure is detected to be high because of very specialized cells that are on these arteries. So as blood is being pumped away from the heart, those vessels stretch. And as those vessels stretch, depending on how much stretch is happening, they're being monitored by these they're called baroreceptors. And these cells, if they are being stretched too much, they're going to be sending a signal that is going to actually decrease the heart contraction strength, which is going to bring it back down so blood pressure can be maintained. This is a classic example, just one of thousands of things that are going on at any given time within your body that the autonomic nervous system is actually handling for us at any given time. There are two major divisions, and you would want to know this language. The sympathetic nervous system is the nervous system that we think of, and we call it the fight or flight response. So in times of stress, and in times of when we're just getting ready for physical activity, exercise, sometimes trauma, arousal, competition, anger, fear, all of those things can actually stimulate the sympathetic nervous system. So what's going to happen? Your heart rate's going to go up, your blood pressure's going to go up, air is going to flow more freely, blood glucose levels are going to go up because you need glucose for ATP. Your air is going to be flowing freely because you need oxygen and glucose for ATP. At the same time that we're in this fight or flight response, and this is the system that is being innervated, maybe it would make sense to you that the parasympathetic system is not going to be getting the attention it needs. So it's going to reduce the blood flow to the digestive organs. The parasympathetic system has often been called your housekeeping system. So meaning that this is when you're in a state of relaxation and you're able to actually digest your meals, you're able to absorb the nutrients that you need, eliminate the waste that you need to get rid of. So this is truly our resting and digesting division. So maybe it makes sense that we need both of these working, and we need both of them working in the correct amount of times. You wouldn't want to stay in the parasympathetic system because we do live in a world that we have to compete. We are sometimes under stress, which is perfectly normal and natural. Anxiety is natural and normal for us to feel, but we would want the sympathetic nervous system engaged in those times to keep us in a state of well-being. So again, when we think about the parasympathetic tone, this is going to maintain those smooth muscles in the intestines. It's going to keep our heart rate at our resting rate. We wouldn't want our heart rate to always be in a state of fight or flight. We actually couldn't even live for very long if that were the case. So the sympathetic tone is going to be keeping blood vessels partially constricted, maintaining blood pressure when it needs to be maintained. So when we think about that sympathetic division, it excites the heart, but it inhibits the digestive and urinary function. So I mostly just want you to understand those two divisions, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. They're both necessary. They're both necessary, but you wouldn't want to stay in one or the other for more than you should be staying in them. So that's really the basic information for this chapter. But I'll go ahead and we'll look at a few other things. When we think about the autonomic nervous system, we know that it is controlled by both the central and the peripheral nerves. So when we think about the central nervous system, we know that hypothalamus, the seat of our universe, right? And other brainstem regions are really involved in controlling blood pressure, respiratory, all of those different divisions. And then we also know that of the peripheral nervous system, the motor neurons and peripheral ganglion, these are also playing a role in helping to affect the changes that need to happen when you are in a state of relaxation or when you are in a state of, fight or flight. And fight or flight doesn't always have to be so dramatic. It really truly can be like maybe just finishing a project that you're working on, or having to meet and have an interview, or doing whatever. It can be just natural, normal things that you're going to be doing on a day-to-day basis. So when we think about the visceral or organs that are influenced by this system, the autonomic system, we know that those messages, there's actually a two-way, there's two neurons involved in that. When we think about the somatic or skeletal muscle, we had one motor neuron, just one neuron, causing the skeletal muscle to contract. So physiologically and anatomically, it's a little bit different. I would never ask you this. It's just FYI. Mostly what I would want you to know is that our nervous system has to be able to detect. It has to be able to send action potentials, which in the form of millivoltage changes, electrical currents, to the ends of the axons where neurotransmitters are released. In this case, you see ACH, acetylcholine, as the neurotransmitter. That will then hit the receptor cells, and there will be an affected change. Again, whether it is a direct, like in the the somatic effectors, like the skeletal system, or whether it is going to be several cells involved in that. It typically happens pretty quickly, and We understand that not only does the presynaptic cell have to be functioning, but the neurotransmitters have to be there and have to be secreted. Then the postsynaptic cell has to have the receptors, the protein receptors that respond, and so forth and so on. So we know that this is a normal situation, but we know disease can happen at any level. It can happen in the presynaptic cell. Disease can be at the synapse itself. Disease can be at the receptor level of the postsynaptic cell, or later on in that postsynaptic cell. So understanding this physiology helps us to understand the normal physiology, helps us to understand that when someone has disease or injury, then where that problem is lying and why the treatment is given to affect a change at that site. So that's the basics of that. In this particular chapter, you have some comparisons of the somatic versus the autonomic nervous system. Somatic being the skeletal muscle, and autonomic being those viscera and those sometimes cutaneous glands. But you can see some of this. I would mostly just want you to understand that there is a difference. I'm not going to ask any sort of specifics here, but I want you to just be familiar with the terminology. So again, the sympathetic division is innervating from the spinal cord all of these organs you can see, but so is the parasympathetic, and we'll get to this slide as well. Again, the sympathetic is our fight or flight response, and we expect all these vital signs to increase. And our parasympathetic is that resting and digesting, which is just as important response and is important as well. So when we think, let's go back to the sympathetic division again, and I do want to bring your attention to something that I think is important for you to know at this point. And that's that the sympathetic system, that fight or flight, carries out many of its responsibilities: increasing blood pressure, increasing heart rate, increasing heart contraction strength, doing all of that through stimulating the adrenal glands to actually release epinephrine and norepinephrine. Right or wrong, I often will just link those two together. I'll say norepinephrine, epi and norepinephrine just as together. They're slightly different from one another, but they are catecholamines that are released from the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands are sitting on top of your kidneys, almost like a little cap sitting on your head, and you have a cap on. And this is why they're called what they're called. Ad means superior to, and renal means kidneys. So these are glands that are superior to the kidneys, and that's where you find them. So that's their anatomy this is where you would find them. Their name actually tells you. So anyway, make sure you know that the adrenal glands in times of stress, and sometimes it can be just, stress is normal, and then, whatever, they're secreting epinephrine and norepinephrine as these neurotransmitters and acting like hormones as well, signaling changes in their target cells. All right, so, and again, the parasympathetic system, our resting and digesting system, is really going to help to slow down heart rate, send blood and what the digestive system needs to move substances through the digestive tract, which is about a 30-foot tract. So anyway, sorry about that. And so this is the parasympathetic division, and you can look at some of those. Now comparing these, some comparisons of this, you can just FYI take a look at some of this. And again, that's just for your information. I'm not going to ask you any details about that, just that you would know the basic difference between those two. There's also something else I want to bring to your attention here, and that's called the enteric nervous system. When you hear the term enteric, it is referring to digestion. So this is going to be the nervous system of the digestive tract. It does not arise from the brainstem or spinal cord. And what this is doing, it's really almost like a separate little system. It has its own sort of reflexes, and we know reflexes mean stereotypical involuntary responses. And this is such an important system because it's going to be regulating how things move through that 30-foot tract, and it's going to absolutely be necessary for the normal functioning of all of these systems. They don't really truly stand alone. So they're always communicating, and these are not things that you should have to be thinking about. We take a lot for granted when we think about our autonomic nervous system and all that it is doing for us. When we think about this enteric, the digestive system, I want to bring to your attention something that can sometimes, this is thankfully not a really common occurrence, but there is something that can happen when this system is not actually innervated. So if there's no innervation in that last part of the large intestines, the colon and the rectum, the sigmoid colon is the last section of the large intestines that leads to the rectum. And then the rectum, obviously, then there's the anus, right? But when there's no innervation there and substances can't move past that site, it's constricting them, and then the feces are backing up in the colon. It ends up causing this not only impactions and constrictions, but it actually causes the colon, because the colon is really a muscular tube. Our entire GI tract is really a 30-foot muscular tube that is contracting just when it needs to push things along. But if it's not doing that, like it's not in this particular area, then feces back up, and as they back up, they stretch out the colon. And as that colon gets stretched out, it becomes what is known as a megacolon, a massive dilation of the bowel. This can become life-threatening. So if that happens, then the tissues can start to die. You can have gangrene happening in this area, which is immediately life-threatening. The bowel can perforate, which is another immediately life-threatening event. And peritonitis, inflammation of that peritoneal cavity. The intestines are in this cavity that's known as the peritoneum. And that cavity should be sterile. Now, inside the intestines, as food is moving through and actually becoming feces inside, this is not sterile. But if that bowel perforates, then all of those microbes can get into the peritoneal cavity, which should be sterile. So that is what is meant by peritonitis, inflammation of that peritoneum. And again, all of these things are life-threatening. So we really don't want to see that. Now they give you an example here that this can happen even in newborns. Newborns who fail to have their first bowel movement, there's a real concern that a megacolon may be actually happening. And so they're going to be very careful to make sure that they rule that out in their diagnosis. But megacolons can also happen because of other infectious diseases like Clostridium difficile, what people call C. diff, and other types of conditions. It can happen at any age. This particular one, Hirschsprung disease, is actually it's a hereditary defect where there is no enteric nervous system innervation. So this is one cause of a megacolon. All right, so we need our enteric nervous system functioning, things that we don't typically have to think about, but we need it functioning. So neurotransmitters we've already touched on. We know that there are more than 100 known neurotransmitters. We're actually still discovering things that neurotransmitters we've known about for a long time, but we didn't know all the things that they do. We're still discovering things. So we have talked about acetylcholine. We've talked about many others as well. The neurons that secrete acetylcholine are called cholinergic neurons, or cholinergic receptors if they're the postsynaptic cell. And we know that of these, they can either excite or inhibit. It just depends on the receptor, the target cell. And muscarinic receptors can either excite or inhibit. Nicotinic receptors tend to only excite. So if you ever hear that terminology, muscarinic or nicotinic, that is what that's referring to. And then we also know that norepinephrine, these are referred to as adrenergic, the adrenal glands. Adrenergic receptors might be a term that you all would hear, but again, depending on the target site, it may be exciting that target cell, or it may be inhibiting. The thing is, they're both important. They're both important depending on what the target site is, and you want them both being able to function depending on what you're needing them to do. So I think a lot of this has actually been a little bit of review, potentially, at least I hope so. And I think that, but I do think it was worth maybe going over these. Now, I also wanted this just shows you more pictures of these neurons and how they have to be functioning, just as a visual there for you to see. And again, it talks about how some of these neurotransmitters are going to act antagonistically, which means they oppose each other. An antagonist opposes. Some are going to act as synergistic or cooperative, and that means that they're going to have a unified effect. So, again, that's just sort of FYI for you there, but some of them actually, have different responses depending on where they're actually going to be seen. Now, the autonomic nervous system is regulated on several levels. Maybe you all realize, by this age, we all realize that our frontal lobes, our cerebral cortex and the frontal lobes, where we have our personality and planning and judgment, and all of that is happening. We understand that if we get emotional, there's a physiological change, isn't it? So anger, fear, anxiety, they all influence the autonomic nervous system. So, and they're not bad things up to a point, but controlling that can be very important for overall well-being and health, because we understand that that can be over the top. The hypothalamus is actually also playing a huge role as well. We talked about hunger, thirst, sex. So many different primitive functions are being carried out by this hypothalamus. It carries it out, many of them out, by controlling the pituitary, as we've talked about. But also it has some direct effects as well. So this is, again, when we think about the autonomic nervous system, it is both the cerebral cortex and the hypothalamus playing a role in that. Now, I also wanted to let you know about these reflexes. We know what reflexes are. We know that these are stereotypical involuntary types of responses, but there are like defecating, bowel movements, micturition is urinating. These are integrated in the spinal cord. So the reason I wanted to include this slide is to let you know that when there has been, and so we think about those as being voluntary, right, instead of involuntary. But I do need you to know that they are incorporated in the spinal cord as sort of a reflex. If there's been injury to the spinal cord, and the injury can be from trauma or it can be from just stenosis, a narrowing. Stenosis means narrowing or closing off of the spinal cord that might be putting pressure on this. Then it can affect sometimes people's ability to be able to control these two actions, bowel movements and urinating. So incontinence is a term that's used when someone has actually lost the ability to voluntarily control these actions. And it can be for a lot of different reasons, including sometimes injury to a spinal cord. So we'll finish this with just a couple of little terms. Neuropharmacology is going to be, as we know, the study of, ology is the study of, pharma means drugs related to that are going to have an effect on the nervous system. We'll recall that there's no such thing as big words. They're just words that we can break down. Prefixes, root words, and suffixes, and hopefully kind of get an understanding or an idea about what that's referring to. Drugs are actually, when you have patients that are on medications and you're looking up those medications to see what kind of activity they have, you look them up sometimes in a PDR, which is the physician desk reference, and you will see terms that will discuss that drug acts as a sympathomimicker or a sympatholytic drug. If something is going to mimic the sympathetic system, then you all would know that drug is going to end up raising blood pressure, raising heart rate, raising contraction strength, and hopefully that's what that patient needs to be on. I have seen and I know that sometimes that nurses and even family members figure out that medications that patients have been on have been doing things that shouldn't have been happening, that was making the patient worse. So, for example, if someone has already a resting high heart rate, you wouldn't want to put them on a drug that's a sympathomimicker. A sympatholytic drug is going to suppress the sympathetic system. So if someone has got high vital signs, then a sympatholytic drug would be more of a one that would be intuitive to put them on. Same thing with parasympathetic mimickers versus lytics. So this is just terminology. So if you see these terms, you'll understand what they are. And many drugs that are out there on the market are affecting the neurotransmitters in the central nervous system. For example, Prozac, which I think I've mentioned in our earlier talks, it is going to block the reuptake of serotonin, so that serotonin can stay in the synapses longer and have potentially, hopefully, more of an effect on that presynaptic cell, meaning that it just helps the serotonin to hang around longer. Because most people who are given Prozac are given that because they are depressed, clinically, chemically depressed, meaning they really are not functioning well. And maybe keeping serotonin around longer in the synapse will help. So that's one example. Caffeine is definitely a drug. It's considered to be the most used drug in Homo sapiens is caffeine. Nicotine and alcohol are the next. So actually the legal drugs are the ones that are the most, sometimes the most abused drugs. A new study just came out that coffee is actually pretty good for you in moderation. So actually the last few studies, scientific studies, have come out that coffee's benefits in moderation outweigh any kind of negative side effects. So I'm really liking that, and I'll cheer to that anyway. So caffeine, though, does, and we know that it's a drug, it competes with adenosine, which is one of our normal nitrogenous molecules, right? Adenosine, we've heard that base before. So it competes with that, and adenosine as a neurotransmitter is actually causing us to be sleepy, which is a natural part of our circadian rhythm. There's part of our day that we need to start winding down and feeling sleepy so that we can actually fall asleep and get that restorative rest that we need to make us healthy. But caffeine competes with it, and that molecule competes with those receptors And that's why caffeine can sometimes give you a boost. When we look at the actual molecules, they're kind of similar. You can see the similarity here and this part of the molecule and the structural formula. And this is why it can actually sometimes interfere with those receptors that adenosine typically is going to be acting on, so that we're feeling like sleeping. So this is a brief talk on just the autonomic nervous system, and thank you for your attention to this. I'll close off now, and then we'll move on to the special senses.